Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection, where my whole goal is to try to help graduate students do more than just survive. I want to see you thrive. As I said last week, I kind of moving into a research series. And so, kind of the context for this is coming off the heels of the teaching assistant series, is try to provide some content that will help you as a graduate student, may help others as well, but it's particularly aimed at graduate students. So, kind of the first topic that I want to talk about. Let me grab my notes here. Is basically just an overview of research, and I taught a research methods class for about 10 years, I guess it was, or so. So some of this draws upon stuff that I used to teach in that class. But so first, I want to provide a context for what I mean by research. And then so we can look at this a couple different ways. So first is kind of like doing a comparison of types of research. So a classic way to do it is look at it of quantitative research versus qualitative research. And we could spend an enormous amount of time talking about the differences between them, but essentially to me, the fundamental difference is quantitative. You're typically you're working with things that can be measured directly. Qualitative would be working with human subjects, and not just, I understand you can measure things about human beings, but it's usually about the narrative, about the stories, it's about the conversation, it's about the words that people say and the meaning making that they make behind it. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it would be human subjects research versus non-human subjects research. Human subjects research could be either quant or qual. But when we talk about non-human research, usually I describe it as what I would call things and stuff research. So oftentimes things and stuff research, you're building something, you're creating something, and then you're typically evaluating it in some way with some predetermined kind of metric that you're using to evaluate the thing or the stuff. And the other thing I would say is usually with things and stuff research, it's a one and done, meaning you test it under certain conditions. It either succeeds or fails. Now, that's not always true because there can be things and stuff research where you do repetitive types of things. Let's say you work with cellular structures or something like that, where you're actually doing repetitive. Maybe you have 100 petri dishes in which you're testing different things. So, again, there's not a one size fits all bucket for research. And so because I work with so many different types of people across so many different disciplines, I try to be inclusive of all that when I talk about research. Another way to think about research is the idea of testing theory versus generating theory, right? This is one of the big differences between quant and qual in a big way, is the quant typically what you're trying to do is you're trying to quant, you're trying to test theory, qual, you're trying to generate theory. Another difference is looking at practice versus theory, right? So are you putting something into practice, or are you generating theory? Another way to look at it is controlled environment versus natural environment. So we can look at research across all of these dimensions, and I'd say, when I was limited to research in the area that I was working in, computer graphics, I had a very narrow view of research. And as I've worked across the institution with lots and lots of different disciplines, my ideas and thoughts about research and the value of every type of research has really changed over time. Suffice to say, I probably had a very narrow view coming out of computer graphics, and what's happened is I kind of see the value that pretty much all of the different things, all the different types of approaches and methods and so forth relative to research can play. Now, another thing that I often like to talk about is this idea of quant versus qual research, right? And to me, it's kind of like cyclical. Historically, there's been kind of some academic snobbery or research snobbery that goes into this conversation. Quantitative researchers look down on qualitative researchers, thinking that it's just a bunch of opinions and that kind of thing. Qualitative researchers look at quantitative researchers and think, well, you're just propeller heads and you want to reduce everything to numbers. So I want to get away from that fight because I think there's value in both of these. So what I'm going to do is kind of a grand test. Hopefully this will work all right. But I'm going to switch to this view, and I've got kind of this cryptic image that I kind of over several years of teaching research methods tried to create this to try to get those who are on the quant side or those who are on the qual side to see the value that's offered by the other side. And so you can see in this image that on one side we have qualitative, which is inductive, and the goal is to generate theory. On the other side, we have quantitative, where we're hypothesis testing, or quite honestly, theory testing, if you will, through observation and experiment. All right, to me, these two things are cyclical. They go round in circles in my mind. And so I think when you think about research, one of the ways, when I talk about the types of research and I give these descriptors, I think it helps you place yourself in those various categories, if you will, of the different types of research. Now, another way that I like to talk about research is this. Whoops, I switched. Sorry. Let me go back to the other one. I didn't realize I would do that. Let's go back to this. Another thing that I like to talk about is this idea of it's a quadrant model of scientific research, which was created by Donald Stokes in 1997, and it's basically published in a book called Pasteur's Quadrant, as actually Pasteur's Quadrant in this quadrant model paper. But I like this description of research because most research comes down to either a quest for understanding, so we're trying to know, or we're trying to put something into practice. We're trying to see what the implications of the use are. And research can actually be both as well. And so this is just another way to categorize research in my mind. And so if you look at research that's predominantly aimed at understanding without implications of use necessarily, not how you use it is not a primary driver, that would be what we would call pure basic research. Bohr, who basically did research into atoms and all that kind of stuff without consideration of the implications of it, at least at the time that the research was being done, would be an example. A second type of research would be use-inspired basic research, or I just like to call it use-inspired research. Right? This is where you actually want to know and you want to put it to use simultaneously. And Louis Pasteur is probably the best example of that. And basically, at least from the Western perspective, I would say the entire field of microbiology could be attributed to the research that he did. Because really he had a concern of why are people dying. So it was really a practical implication, but it led to the whole field of microbiology as well. So that would be use-inspired. And then pure applied research, which is kind of the college that I come from, Edison is the best example, where the primary focus is on use, not necessarily the theoretical implications. Now, historically, there's kind of been this perspective in the scientific community that, nothing would happen in pure applied research if something didn't happen in basic research. And so there was kind of this, and this drove funding in a lot of the federal sponsors for many years. But what I would say is, Edison kind of turned that on its head, because essentially after he had created the light bulb, then physicists actually basically looked at the theory behind it as to why, and won Nobel Prizes for it. So the fact that, to me, again, none of these overshadows the other. They all have their place and all have value. Generally, you're going to find people that lean towards one direction or the other. Because I come out of an applied research area, I kind of have a bias towards that. You'll also have people that come, out of what I would call bench sciences, or sometimes people like to use the word hard science. I don't necessarily care for that word, but they'll come from that bent. My emphasis here is that all the research is important. And basically we need to find, me coming from a comprehensive institution like Purdue, I find value in all of these things. And so I think my goal is to try to actually help all the people, regardless of what kind of research category they might be in. So the last thing that I want to talk about is a concept. Another thing about research is kind of this idea of ways of knowing. And these different ways of knowing, I think, certainly are influenced. Well, the ways of knowing influence kind of where we come from, or where we come from influence how we lean towards ways of knowing. In the show notes, I'm going to put a link to, and it's a somewhat dated paper. It's from 1998, but it's one that I like to. And there's lots of different models of ways of knowing. So I suppose we could have cuss and discuss sessions about this. But to me, there's and I'm working from notes. Sorry if I look to the other side, but I'm looking at my other screen. But basically, in my mind, there are 5 ways of knowing. There's experience, there's intuition, there's religion, there's philosophy, and there's science. And as major categories, experience would be knowledge through senses. Intuition would be through unconscious insight or revelation, if you want to call it that. Religion comes from like a metaphysical or spiritual revelatory kind of thing. Philosophy comes through, it's basically viewed through the human mind. It's the study of reality. And then lastly would be science, would be the study of reality based upon the material aspects of the universe, if you will. And if you take a look at the URL I provided, it provides, I think, a good comparison of these. And my experience has been, I think you can not frame or root or plug in really any kind of research into these 5 dimensions. And as with the rest of my philosophy of research, I find value in all 5 of these things. And I think, the key is that experience, intuition, and religion are more of individualized things. They're hard to document and that kind of thing. If you look at philosophy and science, those are more public things. There's a scientific process behind them in most cases. But I don't think we should discount any of the 5. And that's kind of my biased view of the world. And I recognize that there may be scholars, there may be academics, there may be researchers who don't agree with that viewpoint, and that's okay. We can just agree to disagree. So hopefully this first video talking about kind of giving an overview of research, I kind of present it because it's like I feel like I need to provide, a level set so that when I talk about research, if you watch some of the other videos that will follow, I think this one's kind of important because it's kind of like the index of the words that I use. It gives you a dictionary of how I use words and relative to research and what I mean by them, as well as kind of my philosophy, I suppose, a little bit, and where I'm coming from relative to research. So I hope this video finds you well and that you're being successful. I know we're in the midst of a semester right now here at Purdue. So it's mid-semester, and the mid-semester blahs kind of set in, where the reality of, we're halfway there, but still got a lot of work in front of us. So it has kind of set in. So with that, drop me a line. I'd encourage you, pass this off to other graduate students, friends, people that you think would benefit by having access to this content, particularly if they're graduate students. I know, a lot of what I bring forward in these videos is Purdue-centric, and I don't know how to not do that because that's where I'm at. That's where all my experience is. But I would encourage you to pass this amongst other graduate students or other students that might benefit from this, even early career faculty. I think some of this would be valuable. And I hope I hope it's not just something that you listen to and you mentally ascend to, but I hope it's something that actually impacts your life. With that, I'll say have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.